This is BBIU, BioPharma Business Intelligence Unit. We provide structured insight and strategic analysis. In a world saturated with noise, surface narratives, and politically shaped data, BBIU operates at a different level of resolution. We focus on the forces beneath events: geopolitical and geoeconomic realignment, biopharma structural dynamics, liquidity stress and financial fragility, institutional drift and epistemic erosion, the architecture of power in global systems. Our work is guided by three principles: truth, structural coherence, and verifiable inference. Every model, every report, every forecast you see here is part of the analytical framework we use to brief decision makers worldwide. If you're looking for information, there are many places to go. If you're looking for structure, welcome. Extraction confirmed. Korea's regulatory concessions mark the fulfillment of a U.S.-engineered capital realignment. Executive summary. South Korea has begun dismantling its regulatory protections in the face of U.S. pressure. The latest move, relaxing emission standards for U.S. automobiles and initiating streamlined entry for GMOs and agricultural imports, is not an isolated shift. It is the acceleration of a structural realignment BBIU forecasted months ago. What began as a tariff negotiation has evolved into systemic extraction of capital, of sovereignty, and now of regulatory autonomy. Key structural findings. The frame was lost first. This is just its shadow, in three paths, one trap, July 3rd. BBIU wrote, Korea has already ceded the frame. The question now is not whether the damage can be avoided, but what kind of damage the nation is willing to absorb. That damage is now demonstrable. The loss of regulatory sovereignty is the price Korea is paying for silence in July. Capital outflow was just the beginning. In tariff reduction and $350 billion investment deal, we noted, this is not energy security, it is strategic entrapment. Today, the capital extraction is complemented by full-spectrum alignment. From ships to seeds, Korea's domestic rules are being rewritten. Territory, industry, regulation, 3 layers, 1 outcome. In Trump-Lee summit, we highlighted, baseland ownership remarks escalate the alliance into sovereignty concessions. From territory to tariff to regulation, the relational asymmetry is complete. Korea is no longer a negotiating partner. It is the proving ground of a new U.S. geoeconomic template. Evidence of forecast accuracy. Korea was warned it would be forced to replicate Japan's deal. Rudnick's demands on Sept 13th confirmed this. Silent resistance from the government led to regulatory deadlines, not renegotiation. Capital transfer and industrial relocation were followed by erosion of local standards, exactly as BBIU anticipated. Agriculture, once declared defended, is now exposed to GMO expansion and certification shortcuts. The automobile sector, whose tariffs were already fixed at 15%, now concedes technical sovereignty too. BBIU opinion. This is not trade liberalization. It is the completion of a structural extraction process disguised as free market reform. South Korea's concessions today are not responses to economic crisis. They are compelled adjustments under an asymmetric treaty framework. Even the government's language echoes resignation. Practical flexibility, regulatory harmonization, and market access alignment mask the reality of loss. It is not only the emissions rules or GMO checks that have been weakened, it is the very authority to define the public interest without external approval. The symbolic and material frame that BBIU identified in July has now completed its cycle. Korea's capital has moved abroad, its industrial base is shifting, and now its laws are being overwritten. This is the culmination of a process that did not begin this week, nor this month. It was sealed when Korea accepted the U.S. premise that its sovereignty was negotiable. Final integrity verdict. BBIU's forecast has been confirmed in its sequence, scale, and mechanism. What remains is not to predict further damage, but to reckon with its consequences. The frame is gone, and now that frame is the law. Annex 1. The structural meaning and implications of establishing a U.S. desk in Korea's agricultural quarantine and import system. Definition and true nature of the U.S. desk. Despite benign phrasing, the establishment of a U.S. desk within South Korea's agricultural quarantine authority represents far more than administrative coordination. It constitutes the placement of a semi-permanent foreign presence, specifically an extension of the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, and associated regulatory apparatus, inside the legal and operational structures of the Korean state. This is not merely a liaison channel, nor an information sharing mechanism. It is a regulatory foothold, enabling direct influence over Korea's import decision-making. A compliance gateway, expanding the reach of U.S.-defined standards into Korean law. A sovereign concession, transforming what was once a unilateral domestic process into a bilateral monitored one. In operational terms, Korea's food and quarantine decisions are now subject to foreign review inside its own system. Tick, immediate purpose and U.S. strategic objectives. From the U.S. perspective, the U.S. desk achieves several core objectives. Accelerated clearance of U.S. agricultural exports, bypassing delays or scientific objections. Regulatory harmonization, redefining Korean food safety protocols in line with American norms. Prevention of precautionary barriers, especially against genetically modified organisms, GMO, and hormone-treated products. Real-time oversight, enabling escalation of disputes from within the Korean administration. This is a reconfiguration of power. The U.S. no longer negotiates around Korean requirements. It now influences them from within. 3. Opening the GMO gate, a one-way transition. U.S. agricultural policy has consistently prioritized export of genetically modified crops, corn, soybeans, hormone-enhanced livestock, and industrial food products using chemical processing methods that have faced opposition in many countries under the precautionary principle. With the U.S. desk in place, Korea's ability to delay or reject GMO approvals, enforce stricter quarantine standards, apply local definitions of safe, is diminished. The burden of proof shifts from Korea's sovereign authority to an institution in which U.S. standards are embedded by design. Once established, such products cannot easily be withdrawn, nor can the pipeline be restricted without breaching bilateral obligations. This process reflects a sustained strategy of food politics as leverage. V. Systemic implications, beyond corn and soy. The effects are structural and wide-ranging. Livestock feed dependency. Korean livestock becomes dependent on American GMO feed. Supply chain mutation. Oils, processed foods, and animal products increasingly contain GMO derivatives. Regulatory dismantling. Korea's autonomy in setting quarantine and hygiene standards is eroded. Food sovereignty loss. Korea becomes strategically dependent on U.S. export flows for essential calories and proteins. This is a shift from food importation to food dependency, conditional upon ongoing U.S. approval. V. Strategic and political interpretation. This development finalizes a series of losses. Financial sovereignty, after the $350 billion investment pledge. Industrial sovereignty, after shipbuilding and semiconductor relocations. Legal sovereignty, after tariff leverage imposed extraterritorially. Food sovereignty, now, with quarantine controls under U.S. procedural reach. The U.S. desk marks the transition from managed trade pressure to embedded structural control. The future. Korea's food policy becomes a branch of U.S. export strategy. Political resistance to U.S. agricultural products becomes bureaucratically infeasible. Public health decisions are shaped not in Seoul, but in a joint platform where the U.S. has de facto veto power. In strategic terms, this is not agricultural cooperation. It is regulatory annexation by procedural consent. Annex 2. Economic fallout of the U.S. desk. Internal market destabilization and the path not taken. Structural disruption of the domestic market. The insertion of U.S. influence into Korea's quarantine and food import systems will dramatically alter the internal dynamics of the agricultural sector. Price depression. U.S. GMO corn, soy, beef, and processed foods will enter the Korean market at lower prices due to subsidies and scale advantages. Market displacement. Domestic producers already operating at higher input costs will be unable to compete, especially in non-protected categories beyond rice. Sectoral collapse. Small and mid-sized farms will face accelerated bankruptcy or consolidation under predatory import competition. This is not market liberalization. It is a forced restructuring that undermines national capacity. 2. Feed chains and the invisible dependency mechanism. Once GMO soy and corn enter Korean feed systems, livestock becomes dependent on U.S. commodity streams. The food supply chain becomes tied to dollar-denominated imports. Feed inflation impacts entire protein categories unpredictably. This transformation begins quietly. It ends with a food system controlled externally. 3. Currency exposure and inflationary transmission. Korea, already vulnerable due to fuel import dependence, now faces dual commodity exposure, energy and food priced in USD. Exchange rate sensitivity. Any depreciation in KRW immediately raises food prices. Stagflation risk. Higher consumer prices with stagnant wage growth. Policy tools become ineffective. Monetary sovereignty is diluted. The nation becomes economically brittle. 4. Inequality and rural collapse. The immediate victims, rural communities reliant on domestic food production, smallholders lacking capacity to pivot to exports or high-value crops, consumers who lose access to high-quality domestic products replaced by lower-standard imports. The winners, import conglomerates aligned with U.S. export channels, chaebols who redeem domestic capital through overseas investments, U.S. agricultural corporations embedding their products in Korean supply chains. The result? Internal inequality deepens, and rural Korea becomes a sacrifice zone for global trade. Systemic risk. Food security becomes foreign policy. No longer can Korea buffer food shocks through sovereign control. Sanctions, supply chain disruption, or U.S.-driven export curbs will become direct threats. The Ministry of Agriculture loses autonomy to regulate safety, quantity, or quality. A U.S.-aligned food system becomes a channel for indirect coercion. This is how dependency is crystallized, quietly, bureaucratically, permanently. 6. The road not taken. Sovereignty through selective openness. The tragedy is not that Korea opened its food market, it's that Korea opened it on U.S. terms with no strategic or sovereign filter. What Korea could have done: proactively open its market to non-GMO imports from other nations, Australia, Europe, Latin America. Establish bilateral safety certification with high-standard partners. Promote domestic branding of GMO-free, high-quality Korean food products on global markets. Instead of surrendering to GMO penetration under U.S. supervision, Korea could have redefined itself as a GMO-free haven, gaining domestic trust and international market differentiation. But that path was never considered, because Korea negotiated from fear, not strategy. BBIU Final Assessment. The U.S. desk is not simply an agricultural oversight mechanism. It is a vector of economic destabilization, embedding foreign standard setting within the national food ecosystem. Korea did not lose this battle at the border. It lost it in the regulatory code. American corn may fill the barns and shelves, but it is Korean sovereignty that will be harvested. Annex 3. Geopolitics in flux, Korea's strategic exposure, China's calculus, and the battle for influence 1. Seoul in the crosshairs, when sovereignty becomes a liability. South Korea's government is entering its most vulnerable phase since the THAAD deployment crisis of 2016-17. The revelation of the U.S. desk, an internal regulatory foothold enabling U.S. oversight over Korean food imports, has shattered the government's earlier assurances that no sovereignty was ceded. These inconsistencies expose a widening gap between the administration's public proclamations and its private concessions. This credibility erosion leaves Seoul in a precarious position. Domestically weakened, the public now sees the government's rhetoric of balanced diplomacy as untenable. Externally exposed, both superpowers, China and the United States, now perceive Korea as a divided polity, unable to establish consistent strategic footing. In geopolitics, perception is leverage, and Seoul has just lost control of its narrative. At 6. China's reaction, retaliation and realignment. Beijing has 3 immediate levers. Diplomatic downgrading. China may reduce high-level contact and exclude Korea from regional initiatives. Korea would no longer be treated as a quasi-neutral actor, but as a U.S. satellite. Economic retaliation. China could selectively restrict Korean products, culture, or tourism, a tactic proven during the THAAD backlash. Electronics, cosmetics, entertainment, and luxury goods are especially vulnerable. A few customs delays at Shenzhen or Tianjin port can send powerful signals. Security posturing. China may escalate military activity near the Korean peninsula, not by overt aggression, but through maritime presence, joint drills with Russia, or support to North Korean provocations. The message: your alignment has a cost. Yet, as you insightfully pointed out, China faces a dilemma. Does Korea need China more, or does China need Korea more? Economically, Korea depends on China for trade, tourism, and industrial supply chains. But strategically, China cannot afford to lose Korea entirely to the United States. Not with the first island chain tightening, Taiwan under tension, and the Indo-Pacific becoming a U.S.-anchored military theater. The 3. The Chinese playbook, long game over loud moves. Contrary to popular conceptions, China does not need to strike to regain influence in Korea, nor will it likely escalate North Korean military provocations. Such moves would only deepen Seoul's reliance on Washington. Instead, China works with existing mechanisms, political realities, and internal dynamics, leveraging the swap line. China already extended a $60 currency swap to Seoul. This was not generosity, it was strategic anchoring. Beijing can calibrate this financial lifeline to reward compliance or pressure resistance. Influence through economic and demographic presence. China can quietly expand its cultural and commercial footprint in Korea, especially through migration flows, business networks, and digital channels. The concern here is subtle but real. If migrants from China, including ethnic Koreans from Yanbian, gain long-term residence or voting rights, they could influence local elections, not through coercion, but through civic participation aligned with Beijing's preferences. South Korea's low birth rate creates a vulnerability. Foreign-born populations become politically relevant faster than in other countries. This is a demographic strategy, not espionage, not military pressure, but slow-motion structural influence. Political engineering via timing. China may not seek to topple Lee Jae-myung. In fact, it may prefer to keep him in power long enough to delay Korea's full absorption into the U.S. strategic sphere. Supporting stability, even flawed stability, lets China buy time until an opportunity arises to recalibrate relations. 4. The shadow of U.S. countermoves. The United States will not passively watch Korea drift. Washington values the Korean peninsula as a strategic anchor against China, a tech industrial partner, e.g. chips, defense, a frontline presence in East Asia. If U.S. intelligence perceives that China is gaining soft influence in Korean domestic politics, particularly through demographic or informational channels, it will likely respond. The toolkit could include targeted sanctions, e.g. on entities linked to foreign interference, diplomatic nudging, re-education, visits by high-level envoys, covert support for political factions more aligned with U.S. strategic preferences, increased intelligence sharing under the pretext of countering hybrid threats. This is not fiction. These are historical patterns. A new geopolitical terrain, the Korean Peninsular Dual War. South Korea is no longer just navigating tariffs and trade. It is now the site of a dual influence battle, subtle, persistent, and deeply internal. China is playing the long infiltration game, using time, trade, migration, and proximity. The U.S. is playing the strategic containment game, using law, capital, and security architecture. And Seoul, hampered by its own missteps, is struggling to defend sovereignty not through military force, but through institutional integrity. BBIU final verdict. South Korea is entering a phase where the real war is not over borders or ships. It is over systems, narratives, and votes. China does not need to fire a shot to influence Korea. The United States does not need to stage a coup to retain influence. But unless Korea restores transparency, strengthens democratic institutions, and reestablishes strategic equilibrium, it risks becoming a vassal state, contested in shadows, unable to assert its own destiny. This geopolitical shift is not an abstraction, it is happening now. If your organization requires structural clarity, BBIU is available for private briefings and strategic analysis. To initiate contact, visit BioPharma Business Intelligence Unit.com and reach out through the Institutional Access channel.